New artificial intelligence initiatives by Singapore have been launched at the AI Action Summit in Paris. They focus on ways to develop AI and AI safety. Let's look at what these projects will do. Now, for a start, a global pilot to set up best practices around testing of generative AI applications. The AI Verify Foundation and the Infocom Media Development Authority will be looking at testing real-life applications in areas such as healthcare, finance and public services. And the project is slated to be completed by this May. Singapore is also spearheading a joint exercise with Japan to test how well AI models act across languages. Tests were conducted across 10 languages and in 5 harm categories, including crime and privacy. They aim to see how safety guardrails, which prevent models from doing harmful things, hold up in different linguistic settings. Plus, a new standard to test AI models that can be used in different languages and cultural contexts in Asia Pacific. This was developed through an exercise that involved more than 350 participants from 9 countries to simulate attacks on the models and find possible gaps. Elaborating on the initiatives, Singapore's Minister for Digital Development and Information says they aim to prevent cultural biases that may occur in large language models.
For example, there are many manuals that accompany the appliances that we buy. And if the manual was written in the language that we are familiar with, but it contains errors, you can imagine that in using these appliances, we could cause harm to ourselves. And the equivalent of the testing of large language models in other languages other than in languages, the equivalent of testing these large language models in languages other than English is to ensure that they perform just as well or at least reasonably in other languages.
Speaking at the AI Summit in Paris, Mrs. Teo adds the initiatives are part of Singapore's bid to be a leader in the AI space.
We see AI implementation taking place on a wider scale, and so stronger capabilities in AI safety and governance are going to be much more important. We think that this is also an area that we can contribute in. After all, we were one of the first to introduce an AI governance framework. So these are very useful foundations for us to take the next step. And that is to try and match the testing providers with where the demand for these testing services are going to be.
At the summit, Singapore joined other nations in endorsing a leader's declaration. Its priorities include using AI to reduce digital divides, as well as safe and ethical use of the technology to support economies and societies. And for a clearer picture on Singapore's AI initiatives, we have with us Professor Simon Chesterman on Zoom. He is Senior Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore, a national body guiding AI research. Professor, thank you so much for joining us tonight. For a start, Professor, tell us a bit more about Singapore's AI initiatives in ensuring large language models and Gen AI are able to adapt to multicultural, multi-language contexts.
Well, as the clip from Minister Josephine Teo just highlighted, there's a baseline of making sure that models are useful in different languages. But above and beyond that, we also want to make sure they're appropriate and that they're safe. I think many listeners and viewers will be familiar with the idea of AI hallucinations, coming up with made-up facts and so on, but also that there's the possibility of bias. The problem with this, however, is whose standards are being applied. How do we test if an AI is behaving appropriately? And will this work in different languages? And I think Singapore's initiative really tries to address all 3 of those issues by coming up with clearer standards and analysis, not just of these general principles, fair, equitable, transparent, but what does that actually mean in a particular country? And then how do you, in fact, measure whether an AI system is behaving appropriately in these different use cases? And perhaps most interestingly, given Singapore's multi-ethnic, multilinguistic context, how do they behave differently in different languages? And one of the headline findings, perhaps not surprising, is that even though models aren't perfect in English, they're actually much worse behaved in several other languages, including Southeast Asian languages. And so that's really a wake-up call for us to make sure we're involved in both developing and testing these models.
It is essentially to prevent cultural biases that may occur in LMMs or Gen AI, as you said there. Could you perhaps take us through some examples where these biases may occur?
Yeah, so you can imagine somewhat innocuous cases like you were asking for recipes. And an AI model might give you something more suited to a Western palate than to a Chinese or South Asian or Southeast Asian palate. But then if it starts recommending pork dishes, which might be okay in the United States, maybe that's not okay in some other areas. But these, of course, are not the only use cases that large language models will be deployed for, as they play a bigger role in healthcare, in finance, especially in public services. Many other queries will come up. Users might ask about religion, about politics. And so you want to at least ensure that there's some baseline understanding of how the models might behave in different contexts, so that A, they can be useful, but B, they can avoid introducing harmful content, perhaps misleading or even inflaming tensions in some jurisdictions.
And why is Singapore also taking the lead to work on AI models in different language and cultural settings, Professor? We understand this exercise involved more than 350 participants across 9 countries.
Yeah, so in some ways, Singapore is uniquely positioned to play a role in this. We have a very digitally savvy population. We have a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual population. But also, we've got a reputation, a hard-earned reputation for being a trusted node in the information superhighway. We've got reasonable ties with both China, the US, the Europeans, so we can play that kind of trusted mediating role in helping to develop one of the things that I think is really missing at the moment of the AI space, which is trust in the content. There's a lot of talk about responsible AI, but we've seen just in the last few hours in Paris, the inability even to agree at a global level on a fairly simple declaration about inclusive and sustainable AI. So there's a lot of disagreement on these sort of grand, high politic questions, where Singapore, I think, can play a key role, is not necessarily pushing on those huge issues, but rather establishing tools that will enable us to get the most out of AI systems while mitigating the risks.
It's all about trust when it comes to AI, isn't it, Professor? Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Professor Simon Chesterman with AI Singapore.